Because I have trouble with this complex passage, Epictetus continues, I cast about looking for someone else to actually explain the original explanation to me. I find a commentator and I say to him, here, please have a look at this text and tell me what on earth this means. I ask him as if the thing were written in a completely foreign language, like Latin. Now, Epictetus asks a piercing question about this situation. What right does that commentator actually have to feel superior or proud, just because he can explain the grammar of the text? He points out that even the great Chrysippus himself has absolutely no right to be proud if he only brilliantly explains the will of nature, but does not actually follow it in his own daily life. And if the original author should not be proud, how much less entitled to pride is his mere interpreter? The point is this, he explains. It is not Chrysippus per se as a man that we actually need. We only need his writings insofar as he practically helps us to understand the true will of nature. He uses a religious analogy to make this clear. We do not need the religious prophet for his own sake. We do not worship the man. But through that prophet, we think we can successfully divine the future and better understand the specific signs that the gods send to us. He continues the religious analogy. During a sacrifice, we do not need the animal victim's entrails for their own sake. We only value them for the sake of the divine signs they convey to us. And we certainly do not worship the physical crow or the raven when it flies by as an omen. Instead, we worship God, who actively communicates his will to us by means of those birds. Now Epictetus says, imagine me standing before a holy priest or a prophet at a sacrifice. I say to him, please, carefully examine this victim's entrails. What exactly are they telling me about my life? After carefully spreading the entrails out on the altar, the priest announces his reading. It is clearly written here, the priest says, that you possess an internal will that is completely incapable of being coerced or compelled by anyone. The priest then breaks this down. Let us start with your power of assent, he says. Can absolutely anyone in the world physically prevent you from agreeing with something that you know is true? No, you answer. Or the priest continues, can anyone physically force you into internally believing something that you know is false? No, you answer again. Plainly then, the priest concludes, in this specific area of your mind, your will absolutely cannot be hindered, it cannot be forced, and it cannot be obstructed. Now, let us look at your power of desire and impulse. You will clearly see that it is exactly the same situation. One internal impulse can only ever be overruled by another internal impulse of your own making. But wait, you might object to the priest. What about if someone violently threatens me with death? Surely he compels my will then. The priest corrects this misunderstanding. It is not the physical thing you are threatened with that forces you. It is the internal fact that you yourself personally prefer to do absolutely anything else rather than die. It is your own internal set of values that compelled you to act. It was simply your own will acting on your own will. The priest then explains the theology behind this. If God had actually made it possible for the rational mind, which is a literal fragment of his own divine being that he generously gave us, to be hindered or coerced by anyone at all, even himself included, then he would not truly be God, and he would not be looking after us in the protective way a good God ought to. That, the imagined priest finally says, is exactly what I find inscribed here in the sacrifice. This is God's direct signal to you. If you truly want it, you are completely free. If you want it, you will blame absolutely no one, and you will aggressively accuse no one. If you want it, Absolutely everything in your life will happen perfectly according to plan, both your own plan as well as God's plan. That, Epictetus tells his students, is exactly the kind of practical, empowering prophecy I go to this priest for, and it is what I go to the philosopher for. I go out of deep reverence, not for the man himself, but for his profound powers of interpreting the truth of nature. The text then shifts to a new chapter, titled Do Not Be Angry with Wrongdoers. Epictetus begins by laying out a fundamental psychological principle. Philosophers say that absolutely all people are guided by a single, universal standard in their minds. Whenever they assent to a thing and believe it, it is simply because they genuinely feel it must be true. Whenever they dissent and reject a thing, it is because they genuinely feel that something is not true. And whenever they simply suspend their judgment, it is because they feel that the thing is unclear and they lack enough information. Similarly, philosophers say that in the case of our impulses and desires, people always act because they genuinely feel that the object of their impulse must be to their own advantage. It is completely psychologically impossible for a human being to honestly consider any one thing to be advantageous, but then actively desire something completely different, or to honestly consider one thing to be morally right, but then have an impulse for its opposite. We always act on what seems best to us at the time, even if we are tragically mistaken. If all this psychology is true, Epictetus asks, then what possible grounds do we ever actually have for being angry with absolutely anyone? He says, we constantly use harsh labels like thief and robber in connection with these wrongdoers. But what do these aggressive words actually mean in reality? They do not mean the person is inherently evil. They merely signify that these people are deeply confused in their minds about what is truly good and what is truly bad. So he challenges his students, knowing this, should we actually be angry with them? Or should we naturally pity them instead for their confusion? He gives practical advice. If you simply show them exactly where they go wrong in their reasoning, you will find that they will naturally reform their behavior. But he cautions, unless they can clearly see their own error, they are hopelessly stuck. They are left with absolutely nothing better than their own usual, flawed opinion to serve as their practical guide in life. A harsh student might object and say, well, should not society just do away with all these thieves and degenerates? Epictetus tells him to try putting that exact same question this way instead. Should not we brutally rid ourselves of all people who are simply deceived about what is most important in life? Should not we execute people who are just blind? And I do not mean blind in their physical faculty of vision, their ability to distinguish white from black. I mean people who are blind in their crucial moral capacity to accurately distinguish good from bad. If you put the question that way, Epictetus says, you will immediately realize exactly how incredibly inhumane your position really is. Wanting to kill a thief is exactly as if you were to point and say, should not this poor blind man and this poor deaf man be executed just for being disabled? He explains the logic behind this pity. Because if the loss of a person's absolute greatest asset naturally involves the greatest possible harm to them, and if someone is tragically deprived of their inner moral bearings, which is without a doubt the single most important capacity they possess, well, why on earth would you want to add your own petty anger to their already massive loss? Therefore, if you absolutely must be emotionally affected by other people's moral misfortunes, you should show them gentle pity instead of arrogant contempt. You must completely drop this constant, defensive readiness to hate others and to quickly take offense. He asks directly, Who do you think you are to use those common, nasty curses, saying things like, "These damned fools," and so on? Just let them be, he advises. Since when are you yourself so perfectly intelligent and flawless as to go around harshly correcting all of other people's mistakes? The real truth is, he reveals, we only get angry at thieves because we personally put far too high a premium on the material things that they are able to steal. If you just do not attach such high value to your clothes, then you absolutely will not get angry with the thief who eventually takes them. If you do not make your wife's superficial external beauty her chief attraction, then you will not be furiously angry with the adulterer. You must realize, he says, that the thief and the adulterer absolutely cannot touch what is truly yours, your inner character. They can only touch what is essentially common property everywhere, things that are completely not under your own control. If you can train yourself to make light of those external things and simply ignore their loss, who is there even left to be angry with? As long as you continue to falsely honor material things, you should direct your intense anger strictly at yourself for your own foolishness, rather than at the thief or the adulterer. Look at it this practical way, Epictetus suggests. Imagine you have some beautiful, expensive clothes, and your poor neighbor does not. You have an open window and you want to give your nice clothes an airing out in the breeze. Now, this neighbor does not know what a man's true moral good consists in, but he falsely imagines that it means having beautiful clothes, which, ironically, is the exact same false opinion that you happen to share. Given that shared false belief, it is an absolute foregone conclusion that he is going to try and steal those clothes from you. I mean, think about it. When a group of starving people see you greedily gobbling down delicious food all by yourself, you know for a fact that one of them will eventually make a desperate grab at it. So, Epictetus says playfully, just do not provoke them. Do not air your expensive clothes right at the open window. He then shares a personal story to prove he practices what he preaches. Something very similar actually happened to me just the other day, he says. I usually keep a nice iron lamp sitting right by my household shrine. Hearing a strange noise coming from my window, I ran down and found that the iron lamp had been lifted. Instead of getting angry, I simply reasoned with myself that the thief who took it must have felt a strong psychological impulse that he just could not resist. So, accepting reality, I calmly said to myself, tomorrow you will just get a cheaper, much less attractive lamp made out of simple clay. Epictetus ends with a simple, grounding fact. A man can only ever lose what he actually has. If someone complains, I lost my clothes, Epictetus replies, yes, you lost them precisely because you had clothes in the first place. You cannot lose what you do not have. And if someone complains, I have a pain in my head. Epictetus replies playfully, well, at least you do not have a pain in your horns, right? Because you do not have horns. His point is clear. True loss and the resulting sorrow are only logically possible with respect to the things that we actually own in the first place. You cannot grieve for something that was never truly yours. Someone fearful might object and say, but the powerful tyrant will chain me. Epictetus breaks this down logically. What exactly will he chain? He asks. He will just chain your physical leg. The student pushes further. He will violently chop off. Chop off what? Epictetus interrupts. Just your physical head. What the tyrant will absolutely never be able to chain, and what he will never be able to chop off, is your own inner moral integrity. That inner self is completely untouchable. That, Epictetus explains, is the profound reason behind the ancient philosophical advice inscribed at Delphi to truly know yourself. You must know what is yours and what is not. We should begin to practically discipline ourselves in very small, everyday things, he advises, and from there, we can slowly progress to mastering things of much greater value. For example, if you happen to have a simple headache, you should practice not cursing out loud. Do not curse the universe every single time you have a minor earache. And he clarifies, I am certainly not saying that you cannot complain at all when you are in pain. Only, do not complain with your entire being. Do not let it completely consume your soul. If your servant is a little slow to bring you a medical bandage, do not roll around dramatically on the floor and yell, absolutely everybody in the world hates me. He jokes, who would not actually hate such a ridiculously dramatic person. Instead, he urges, you must walk completely upright and free through life. You must trust firmly in the internal strength of your own moral convictions, and not rely on the fragile physical strength of your body like some kind of wrestler or athlete does. You, as a rational human being, were never meant to be invincible by sheer brute physical force, like a dumb pack animal. You are only truly invincible if absolutely nothing outside of your own internal will can disconcert you or throw you off balance. So Epictetus says, I mentally run through every single difficult scenario in life, and I carefully consider them exactly as an athletic trainer might judge an athlete. I say, okay, he lasted through the first round of the fight. How will he do in the second round? What if it is incredibly hot outside? What if the pressure is on and it is the actual Olympic Games? He applies this athletic testing to morality. Similarly, I say, if you try to entice this man with a large sum of money, he will just turn up his nose at it. Good. But what if the temptation is a very pretty girl whom he happens to meet alone in the dark? Will he resist then? What if you tempt him with widespread political fame? Or what if you test him with public censure and hatred, or with thunderous applause? Or what if you test him with the ultimate threat of death? If the student can handle absolutely all of these external things without breaking, Epictetus says, that is impressive. But he pushes the test even further. What if it is really sweltering, so to speak? That is, what if he is heavily drunk? Or what if he is feverish and delirious? Or what if he is just dreaming in his sleep? Can he maintain his moral character even then? If he can successfully come through safely, and with his integrity intact under absolutely all of these extreme conditions, well, that is the definition of the truly invincible philosophical athlete, so far as I am concerned. The text then moves to a new chapter, titled How We Should Act Towards the Powerful. Epictetus observes a common human flaw. A person who currently enjoys some kind of worldly advantage, or even just mistakenly believes that they do, will almost invariably grow to be incredibly arrogant, especially if they are uneducated in philosophy. The powerful political tyrant, for example, will arrogantly say to you, "My power is absolutely supreme in this land." Epictetus shows how a philosopher should respond to such a boast. "Oh, your power is supreme," he says. "Will you do a favor for me then? I want to have completely uncurbed, fulfilled desires. Do you even have that kind of psychological power to give to me? No. Well, I want my inner sense of aversion to be completely error-free. Do you have that? How about giving me a faculty of impulse that is entirely faultless?" No, Epictetus points out to the tyrant, you have absolutely no connection to that kind of real power. Look at it this way, he tells the tyrant. You entrust your own life to the humble pilot's specific expertise when you are on board a ship, and you entrust yourself to the superior skill of the driver when you are riding in a carriage. It is absolutely no different with all other practical skills in life. You rely on others constantly. So honestly, what does your so-called supreme advantage actually amount to in the real world? The tyrant might counter and say, but absolutely everybody gives me their constant attention and their utmost respect. Right, Epictetus answers dismissively, and I pay constant attention to my little wooden blackboard. I am always carefully wiping it down and washing it clean. And for my simple clay oil flask, I will even go to the trouble of driving a special nail into the wall just to hang it up safely. Does all of that careful attention somehow make those inanimate things morally better than me? No, of course not. It just means that they happen to be practically useful to me in some way. He continues the analogy. I look after my horse, too. I carefully wash its feet and I brush its coat until it shines. The simple fact is, everybody just looks after themselves and their own interests. If all these flatterers currently curry favor with you, tyrant, it is exactly as if they are just currying and brushing their own horse. They just want to use you. He asks the tyrant a devastating question. Who is there in this entire crowd who actually respects you as a genuine human being? Who actually wants to be like you on the inside? Who wants to emulate your moral character the way people so desperately emulated the great Socrates? Nobody. The tyrant, angered by this lack of respect, threatens the philosopher. But I can cut off your head, he yells. Epictetus gives a brilliant, sarcastic reply to this threat of violence. Good point, he says to the tyrant. I had completely forgotten that I should carefully look out for you in the exact same way that I would look out for some deadly virus or a nasty biological infection. I suppose I should even erect a grand religious altar to you, based exactly on the model of the famous altar of fever that the fearful people built in the city of Rome to ward off sickness. You are not a god to be worshipped. You are just a disease to be avoided. Epictetus then analyzes the psychology of political oppression. What is it exactly that frightens most people and successfully keeps them so subdued? He asks. It cannot actually be the physical tyrant himself, and it cannot even be his heavily armed bodyguards. Because, he explains, whatever nature has made truly free, which is the human will, can only ever be disturbed or hampered by itself. Nothing external can touch it. So he concludes, it is a person's own internal thoughts that unnerve them and make them a slave. For example, if a tyrant threatens to physically chain our leg, whoever holds his physical leg in very high regard will immediately break down and beg for mercy. Whereas, the philosophical person who cares far more for his own internal moral character will simply answer back and say, go right ahead and chain it, if that is really what you want to do. The tyrant, baffled by this defiance, asks, and you really do not care? I do not care, the philosopher replies calmly. Furious, the tyrant shouts, just you wait. I will physically show you exactly who is in charge here. Epictetus laughs at this empty threat. How exactly do you propose to do that? He asks the tyrant. The supreme god, Zeus himself, has personally given me my absolute freedom. He was certainly not going to ever allow any true son of his to be completely enslaved by another mortal. Now, you may be the physical master of my fleshy corpse, and if that is the case, then please come and help yourself to that. But you are not the master of me. The tyrant tries another tactic to prove his superiority. What about when you come and petition me for a political favor? He asks. Is not that clear proof of your high regard for me? No, Epictetus answers bluntly. It is simply me looking after myself and my own practical interests. If you really press the point, I will gladly concede that, in the process of asking for a favor, I give you the exact same level of attention that I give to my dirty dishes when I wash them. You are just a practical tool. Look, Epictetus explains, this philosophical attitude is not just petty selfishness. It is simply the fundamental nature of the beast. Absolutely everything that we humans do is ultimately done for our own ends. Even the physical sun itself moves across the entire sky specifically for its own ends. And even the supreme god Zeus himself acts primarily for his own aims. But Epictetus adds a crucial caveat about this self-interest. When Zeus wants to be properly worshipped as the rain bringer, or the grain giver, or the loving father of gods and men, it is completely obvious that he can only actually gain his goals and earn those glorious epithets by actively doing some major, tangible benefit for the world at large. In the exact same way, he explains, Zeus specifically designed the rational animal, meaning man. He made man completely incapable of truly attaining any of his own private, selfish ends without, at the exact same time, actively providing some benefit for the human community. The practical upshot of this divine design, Epictetus concludes, is that it is absolutely not antisocial to be constantly acting in one's own self-interest, because true self-interest naturally aligns with helping others. We do not realistically expect someone, after all, to be completely indifferent regarding himself and his own personal welfare. That instinct for self-preservation is the very basis of our Stoic principle of appropriation. It is the fundamental biological instinct that drives absolutely everyone's behavior. Consequently, he explains, when uneducated people are deeply mistaken in the views they hold about all these external things that lie completely outside the control of the will, meaning, they falsely think that wealth and power are actually good, or that poverty and pain are actually evil, they are naturally going to grovel fearfully before these tyrants. And Epictetus laments if only the groveling ended there. But they do not just flatter the tyrant. They grovel before the tyrant's lowly lackeys, too. He asks his students to explain this absurd social phenomenon to him. Tell me, he says, how do completely uneducated underlings suddenly become wise philosophical sages the exact moment that the emperor elevates them to the menial post of his personal bathroom attendant? Why are we all suddenly walking around saying things like, "Oh, the advice that Felicio the bathroom attendant gave to me today was very astute"? Epictetus jokes, I honestly hope that Felicio gets immediately kicked out of the imperial toilet, just so I can see you instantly change your mind again and publicly declare that he is a complete fool. He ends with a hilarious true story about his own former master to prove this point. My old master, Epictetus, once owned a certain slave who worked as a shoemaker. Epictetus eventually sold this slave because he decided the man was absolutely no good at his job. But as blind chance would have it, this exact same slave was eventually bought by a member of the imperial household, and he somehow became the personal shoemaker to the Emperor Caesar himself. And you really should have seen how my old master Epictetus flattered that shoemaker then. Epictetus would go up to this man and say, "And how is my dear friend Felicio today?" And whenever one of us slaves asked, "Where is the master?" we would invariably be told, "Oh, he is very busy. He is in a private conference with Felicio." Epictetus points out the absolute hypocrisy here. Had not Epictetus literally just sold him off a short time ago specifically because he was completely useless? How on earth did this mere shoemaker magically become so incredibly knowledgeable and wise all of a sudden? Well, Epictetus answers that ridiculous behavior is exactly what inevitably comes of valuing absolutely anything that is not under the direct control of your own will. He gives another common example of this social delusion. Someone is suddenly raised to the high political office of tribune, and he proudly accepts congratulations on every hand from the crowd. One person excitedly kisses his eyes, another kisses his cheek, and his own slaves even humbly kiss his hands. When he finally gets home, he finds dozens of festive lamps being lit all over the house in his personal honor. He then proudly mounts the hill to the Capitol, where he formally offers a grand public sacrifice of thanks to the gods. Now Epictetus asks his students point blank, who in the history of the world has ever once offered a grand sacrifice just for having right desires, or for having moral impulses that are in perfect agreement with nature? No one. We only ever seem to thank the gods, it seems, for what we popularly and mistakenly suppose are the actual good things in life, like wealth and political power. He tells another story about these false values. A man spoke with me just today, Epictetus says, about his plan of accepting a prestigious priesthood of the Emperor Augustus. I strongly told him not to touch it. I warned him, you will lay out a massive amount of your own money for very little actual return. But the ambitious man argued back, if I am a priest, the city clerk will permanently add my name to all the official public contracts. Epictetus mocked this vanity. Are you actually planning to be there in person every single time a city contract is signed, just so you can proudly announce to the assembled crowd, hey, look, that is my name he is writing down there? And besides, he adds, even if you can physically attend all these signing ceremonies right now while you are alive, what exactly will you do to show off when you inevitably die? But the man protested desperately, my name will survive me. If that is all you want, Epictetus replied dryly, just carve it into a heavy stone, and it will survive you just as well. Outside of this small city of Nicopolis, though, absolutely no one in the wider world is ever going to remember you or your name anyway. But the man tried one last defense. As a priest, I get to wear a magnificent crown of solid gold. If you truly have your heart so set on wearing crowns on your head, Epictetus suggested simply, why not just make one out of beautiful, fresh roses? You will honestly look even more elegant in that, and it will cost you nothing. The text then shifts to a new, highly philosophical chapter, titled Concerning Reason, and how it studies itself. Epictetus begins by outlining a basic principle of logic. Every single craft or faculty has a specific field with which it is primarily concerned. When the faculty happens to be fundamentally like the very thing that it studies, it naturally comes to be able to study itself. When it is different, however, then it simply cannot do so. To give a practical example, the craft of shoemaking works exclusively on physical leather, but the abstract craft itself is quite distinct from the physical leather. Therefore, the craft of shoemaking cannot study itself. Similarly, the art of grammar obviously has to do with written speech, but is the abstract art of grammar itself a piece of written speech? No, it is not. Therefore, grammar cannot study itself either. Now he asks, for what exact purpose did Mother Nature specifically arm us humans with the faculty of reason? The purpose was to enable us to make the correct, logical use of our mental impressions. And what exactly is reason itself, if not a complex collection of individual mental impressions? Therefore, Because reason is made of the very same stuff that it processes, it naturally comes to be able to turn its sharp analysis back upon itself. He applies this same logic to morality. And what does the high virtue of wisdom actually profess to investigate? It investigates things that are good, things that are bad, and things that are morally indifferent. And what is wisdom itself? Wisdom is inherently good. And what is ignorance? Ignorance is inherently bad. Therefore, since wisdom is good, it is completely natural for wisdom too, then, to be able to investigate itself, as well as to investigate its exact opposite, ignorance. Because of this incredible self-reflecting power of reason, Epictetus concludes, the absolute first and most fundamentally important duty of the true philosopher is to constantly test his own mental impressions. He must carefully choose between them, and he must only ever deploy those specific impressions that have rigorously passed the logical test. He uses a financial analogy to illustrate this rigorous testing. You know how, with physical money, which is an area where we all firmly believe our personal interest to be very much at stake, we have painstakingly developed the complex art of assaying metals. And you know how considerable human ingenuity has gone into developing a reliable way to scientifically test if those coins are actually counterfeit. We use an entire battery of tests for these coins, Epictetus points out, involving absolutely all of our physical senses, our sight, our smell, our hearing, and our touch. The professional assayer will carefully let the silver denarius drop onto a hard surface, and he will listen intently to its unique metallic ring. And importantly, he is not satisfied to listen to it just one single time. After repeated, careful listenings, he practices so much that he practically acquires a trained musician's incredibly subtle ear for the sound of true silver. All of this intense effort, Epictetus notes, is a clear measure of the extreme effort we are fully prepared to expend to aggressively guard ourselves against financial deception when accuracy and wealth are at a premium. When it comes to our poor mind, however, we somehow just cannot be bothered to put in even a fraction of that effort. We are perfectly satisfied just lazily accepting any and all random impressions that pop into our heads. We do this because, unlike losing a physical coin, the moral loss we suffer when we accept a false impression is simply not immediately obvious to our eyes. If you truly want to know just how little concerned you actually are about things that are genuinely good and bad, and how ridiculously serious you are about things that are morally indifferent, just compare your attitudes. Compare your utter terror about the prospect of physically going blind with your completely casual attitude about being mentally and morally in the dark. If you honestly compare the two, you will immediately realize, I think, exactly how entirely inappropriate and inverted your values really are. A student complains about this demanding Stoic curriculum, but all this constant testing of impressions calls for a whole lot of preparation, and it requires years of hard study. So what? Epictetus shoots back. Do you actually think that the absolute greatest art in the entire world, the art of living a good life, can be acquired easily and completely overnight? It is true, he admits, that the principal doctrine of the Stoic philosophers is actually very briefly stated. You only have to read the founder Zeno for a few minutes to clearly see my meaning. After all, how long does it actually take to just say the words, "The ultimate goal of life is to follow the gods, and the entire essence of the good is the proper, rational use of our mental impressions"? It takes seconds to say that. But he explains, just because that core formula is so incredibly brief, it naturally prompts a whole series of other complex questions. A thinking person immediately asks, well, what exactly is God, and what exactly is an impression? How does my own individual nature practically compare with the massive nature of the universe as a whole? And suddenly, just by trying to answer those necessary questions, the philosophical inquiry is beginning to drag out into a long course of study. He then turns to criticize a rival philosophical school to prove his point. Here we have Epicurus, he says, loudly claiming that true goodness is absolutely none other than the physical flesh and its pleasures. But then, to justify that simple claim, there are suddenly countless long lectures to sit through about man's dominant internal principle. That is to say, we have to listen to lectures about what man's actual substance and essence really are. And so, the Epicurean explanation begins to grow very long and complicated again, too. Epictetus uses a simple biological analogy to poke a hole in Epicurus's logic. It is not at all likely that the true good of a snail simply lies in its hard external shell. So, given that, is it really likely that Epicurus is actually correct in identifying man's ultimate good merely with his physical body? The body is just our shell. He addresses the dead philosopher directly to point out a massive contradiction. Take yourself, Epicurus, he argues. Even you yourself clearly have an internal faculty that is vastly greater than the mere physical flesh. You have a rational faculty which, having carefully examined and deeply thought through all the philosophical evidence, eventually concluded that flesh was the principal thing. Your mind made that decision, not your body. Furthermore, Epictetus asks him, why on earth are you so incredibly fond of burning the midnight oil, staying up late and working so hard to produce so many complex philosophical books on our behalf? Obviously, it must matter deeply to you that we humans be put in full possession of the truth. But if all that matters is physical pleasure, who exactly are we to you? And more to the point, who are we to you that you would sacrifice your own physical comfort and sleep just to educate us? Well, Epictetus concludes sarcastically, now the logical explanation of Epicurus's own contradictory views is growing quite lengthy, too. The text then shifts to a new chapter, titled To People Who Want to Be Admired. Epictetus begins with a core psychological truth. When someone is truly and properly grounded in their own philosophical life, they absolutely should not ever have to look outside of themselves for the approval of the crowd. He imagines a conversation with such a misguided person. My friend, he asks, what is it that you truly want out of your philosophical training? The person gives the perfect, textbook Stoic answer. I am completely satisfied if my inner desires and my aversions perfectly agree with nature. I am satisfied if I exercise my natural impulse and refusal exactly as I was born to do, and if I diligently practice my purpose, my design, and my assent in the exact same rational way. Epictetus, seeing through this fake humility, asks, so, if you already have all that internal peace, why exactly are you acting so stuck up and arrogant in public? The person finally admits the ugly truth of their vanity. I act this way because I actually want absolutely everyone I meet to admire me. I want a crowd of people to follow me around the city constantly shouting, wow, what a truly great philosopher he is. And who exactly are all these people that you so desperately want to be admired by? Epictetus asks the vain man. Are not they the exact same ordinary, uneducated people that you yourself are constantly in the habit of calling completely crazy and misguided? And is this truly your grand life ambition? Then, after all your philosophical studies, to just win the fleeting approval of lunatics. The text then begins a new chapter, titled On Preconceptions. Everyone in the world has basic, built-in moral preconceptions, Epictetus explains. And importantly, one natural preconception does not actually contradict another preconception. I mean, he asks, who among us does not naturally assume that whatever is truly good must also be beneficial, and that it is the right choice, and that it is in absolutely all cases something to be deeply desired and actively pursued? Who among us does not naturally assume that true justice is always fair and morally appropriate? We all agree on these broad concepts. So, if we all agree on the basics, where exactly does all human conflict come from? The answer is simple. Conflict comes in the specific application of those broad preconceptions to particular, real-world cases. One person, for instance, looking at a soldier charging into battle will say, "Well done, there is a truly brave man," while another person looking at the exact same action says, "No, he is not brave at all, he is just completely deranged and reckless." This subjective misapplication of shared concepts is exactly how all conflict originates, he explains. And it is the fundamental source of difference among all the different cultures of the world, like the Jews, the Syrians, the Egyptians, and the Romans. They absolutely do not dispute the basic preconception that whatever is holy should definitely be preferred above absolutely everything else, and that it should be pursued in every single case. But they vehemently argue with each other, for example, over the specific application, whether it is actually holy or unholy to eat a piece of pork. Epictetus points to famous literature to prove his point. This exact same misapplication is also the basis of the legendary, tragic conflict between the Greek kings Agamemnon and Achilles in the Iliad. Let us call them up before us right now and question them, he suggests. "What do you say, Agamemnon?" he asks. "Should not we always strive to do exactly what is morally right and proper?" Naturally, Agamemnon would answer. "What about you, Achilles?" Epictetus asks the other hero. "Would not you, of all people, agree and say that we ought to always do exactly what is appropriate in every situation?" Of course, Achilles would reply. "All right then," Epictetus tells them both. "Since you agree on the principle, just apply your shared preconceptions to your current situation." It is exactly here in the practical application that their massive conflict starts. Because Agamemnon says, "I should not have to return my captive prize, Chryseis, to her father. It is not appropriate." And Achilles says, "Indeed, you had better return her. That is the only appropriate thing to do." It is completely obvious to us, Epictetus points out, that at least one of them is severely misapplying his own natural preconception of what is actually appropriate. The argument escalates from there. Then Agamemnon says, "Fine, if it is appropriate that I have to give Chryseis back to her father, then it is appropriate that I should get one of the other men's captive prizes in return to replace her." Achilles, getting defensive, says, "It is not my prize you intend to take, I hope." Agamemnon replies, "Yours, that is exactly right." Achilles demands, "Why should I be penalized like that?" Agamemnon answers, "Because it is not right or appropriate that I, the king, be the only one to go without a prize." And this, Epictetus concludes, is exactly how all human conflicts, even world-ending wars, originate. So he asks his students, what does it actually mean to be getting a true philosophical education? It simply means learning how to accurately apply our natural, built-in preconceptions to particular, real-world cases exactly as nature prescribes. And fundamentally, It means clearly distinguishing what is actually in our own power from what is not in our power. He reviews the Stoic basics. The internal operations of our own will are completely in our power. What is not in our power are external things like the physical body, the body's specific parts, our material property, our parents, our siblings, our children, our country, or our friends. None of those are up to us. Given that division, Epictetus asks, where exactly should we put the concept of the true good then? To which of these two classes of things are we logically going to assign it? Obviously, we must assign the true good exclusively to the class of things that are completely in our own power. It logically follows from this, he explains, that neither physical health nor athletic fitness are actually good in themselves, nor are our children, our parents, or our country. They are all externals. A student, shocked by this harsh truth, points out that extreme view is absolutely not going to win you very many friends or new philosophical converts in the real world. Epictetus accepts the challenge. Well, he says, let us explore the alternative. Let us see what happens if we transfer the designation of good over to external things like health and other externals and see exactly what happens. Suppose someone meets with a tragic misfortune in life and completely loses these so-called external goods. Can that person logically still be happy? Impossible, Epictetus answers. And you might ask, too, how that person will ever be able to remain on genuinely good terms with their neighbors, since it is a fact that we all naturally incline to our own self-interest. Because, he explains, if I believe it is truly in my own best interest to own a piece of land, then it logically becomes in my interest to violently rob my neighbors of their land. If I believe it is truly in my interest to own a warm coat, then it becomes in my interest to pinch one from the public baths. Right there, in that false belief, you have the exact genesis of all human wars, all political factions, and all bloody seditions. Furthermore, he asks, if I value external things, how will I ever be able to stay right with God? Because if I am physically harmed and I meet with material misfortune, I will immediately begin to doubt whether God is actually looking after me. And if I feel He will not help me get the things I want, why on earth should I give Him my respectful regard? I will say, I want absolutely nothing to do with a God who allows me to be in my present miserable state. So naturally, I begin to actively hate Him. And I begin to wonder if the beautiful temples and statues we dedicate to Him are not actually intended to honor a loving Father, but are instead just meant to fearfully placate a malignant, evil force, exactly like how people sacrifice to the disease of fever. If I am suffering materially, glorious honorary titles for God like Savior, Rain-bringer, and Fruit-bringer are simply no longer applicable to Him in my mind. And absolutely all of this misery and impiety, Epictetus warns, comes directly out of falsely identifying the true good with external things. So what should we actually do about this? That exact question, Epictetus says, is the true topic of inquiry for the person who is genuinely out to philosophize and think deep about life. Now, he admits, if I am completely in the dark as to what is truly good and what is truly bad, then I am just crazy and lost. But if I actually do the right thing and correctly locate the true good entirely within the internal realm of my own will, I take a different risk. I risk being publicly ridiculed by society. He paints a vivid picture of this ridicule. Some rich, gray old man, loudly rattling his expensive gold rings and shaking his head at me condescendingly, will come along and say, "Listen to me, my boy, reading philosophy is all right up to a certain point, but do not get carried away with it. This whole question about the true good is just ridiculous. These dusty philosophers can teach you some basic logic, but you yourself already know much better than they do the right, practical way to behave in the real world. Epictetus imagines how a philosopher might respond. Well, I could say to him, if I already know exactly what to do, as you say I do, then please do not make an objection if what I choose to do right now is philosophize. But Epictetus admits, I am not actually going to try to engage this fatuous old fool in a serious logical debate. He would not understand it anyway. But on the other hand, if I just ignore him altogether, his fragile ego will make him explode in self-righteous indignation. So, to keep the peace, I have absolutely no choice but to just humbly say to him, please, sir, just humor me as you would humor someone who is foolishly in love. I cannot help myself, you see. I am just mad. The text then shifts to a new chapter, titled Against Epicurus. Epictetus again attacks his philosophical rival. Even Epicurus himself, he says, clearly realizes that we humans are deeply social creatures by nature. But the problem is, once Epicurus has falsely identified our ultimate good simply with our physical shell, meaning our body, he absolutely cannot say anything else that is logically inconsistent with that core premise. For he further insists, and rightly so based on his flawed logic, that we must not respect or approve of absolutely anything that does not share in the nature of what is fundamentally good. And for him, the only good is physical pleasure. So Epictetus asks a series of probing questions. If this is true, how is it that we Epicureans are so suspicious of others? How is it that we who supposedly have no natural, unselfish affection for our own children still worry about them? Why is it, Epicurus, that you strongly dissuade the wise man from getting married and bringing up children? Are you secretly afraid that he may actually become deeply emotionally involved with them, and therefore risk becoming unhappy if something bad happens to them? And is that exact same fear the reason why you yourself have been so terribly anxious on behalf of your own house slave mouse? Epictetus points out the hypocrisy. If pleasure is the only good, well, what is it to Epicurus, anyway, if his little slave mouse gets hurt and comes crying to him? Why should he care if he has no natural affection? The answer, Epictetus explains, is that Epicurus is fighting against his own human nature. No, Epicurus actually realizes that, once a child is born, it is simply no longer in our human power not to love it or care for it. It is biologically hardwired into us. Which is the exact reason why Epicurus also says that a man of sense will absolutely not take part in public politics, either. Because he knows the inevitable emotional toll it takes on a person who cares for their community. Epicurus knows the complex kinds of personal connections that public politics inevitably involves, and he wants to avoid them. So, Epictetus asks, what is to actively keep us from just living exactly as if we were as completely unsocial and isolated as common flies? But Epictetus continues, as if Epicurus did not already know that humans are deeply social. He actually has the sheer gall to suggest in his writings that we should simply abandon our own children to avoid emotional pain. Epictetus points out the absurdity of this with animals. Even a simple sheep does not ever desert its own offspring, he notes, nor does a vicious wolf. So, should a rational human being really desert his own child? Would you, Epicurus, actually have us be even more foolish than dumb sheep, or even more savage than wild wolves? because neither of those animals abandons its young. Come on, Epictetus challenges the Epicureans. Whoever actually remembers your cold philosophical advice when they personally see their own little child fallen down and crying on the ground? Human nature simply overpowers philosophy in that moment. Personally, Epictetus jokes with a dark sense of humor. I imagine that your own mother and father, Epicurus, even had they perfectly predicted that you were going to grow up to say such terrible things, still would not have exposed you as a baby to die in the wilderness. Their natural love would have saved you, even if you do not believe in it yourself. The text then moves to a new chapter, titled How We Should Struggle with Circumstance. Epictetus gives his students an empowering perspective on adversity. The true character of a man is only really revealed in difficult times, he explains. So, whenever trouble eventually comes your way, you must think of yourself as a professional wrestler whom God, acting exactly like a master trainer, has purposefully paired in the ring with a very tough, aggressive young buck. And for what specific purpose has God given you this difficult opponent? To actively turn you into Olympic-class material. But Epictetus warns, this elite training is going to take plenty of sweat and hard work to actually accomplish. From my own philosophical perspective, he encourages his students. Absolutely no one's difficulties ever gave him a better, more perfect test than your own difficulties are giving you right now. That is, of course, if you are actually prepared to make good use of them in the exact same way that a wrestler makes use of an opponent who is in peak physical condition. He uses another metaphor, comparing the Stoic philosopher to a military scout. Now, he says, imagine that we are sending you to the corrupt, dangerous city of Rome as a spy to scout out the situation. And we certainly do not want to send a spy who is easily frightened. We do not want one who will cowardly turn back at the very first sound of a strange noise, or at the mere glimpse of a dark shadow, running back and announcing hysterically that the enemy is practically at the gates. If you cowardly tell us on your return from Rome, oh, conditions are absolutely terrible in Rome. There is everywhere death, political exile, grinding poverty, and government informants. Everything is a complete shambles. Fly for your lives, the enemy is completely upon us. If you say that, Epictetus warns, we will just respond by telling you that, in the future, you should keep your cowardly forecasts entirely to yourself. Our only real mistake was in sending a terrible spy like you in the very first place. He contrasts this coward with a true philosopher. The great cynic philosopher Diogenes, he points out, went scouting to the exact same world long before you did, and he came back with a very different report. Death, Diogenes calmly said, was absolutely not an evil thing, simply because it was not morally dishonorable. Worldly reputation, he reported, was nothing more than the empty, meaningless noise of complete fools. And Diogenes said many other profound things that helped entirely remove the element of irrational fear from physical pain and from poverty. In his own daily manner of life, he practically demonstrated this. He happily preferred the absolute minimum of clothing to a rich purple gown, and he preferred sleeping on the bare ground to sleeping on a bed, no matter how soft that bed was. And as absolute proof of the truth of such bold claims, he actively produced his own inner assurance, his unshakable serenity, his profound freedom, as well as his remarkably tough, radiant physical physique. There is absolutely no enemy anywhere nearby, Diogenes confidently reported. All is peace and total tranquility in the world. Explain yourself, Diogenes, someone might ask. Diogenes would simply reply, "Look for yourself. Am I physically wounded? Am I disabled? Or am I currently in panicked flight from any kind of enemy force? No." That, Epictetus declares to his students, is exactly the kind of brave spy that we philosophers truly honor. You, on the other hand, just bring us back a cowardly report that is full of a lot of random, meaningless noise. Go off and make a much better search of the world, he commands, and this time do it completely without all the fearful trepidation. A student, feeling helpless, asks, "What exactly should I do then?" Epictetus answers with a simple nautical analogy. "What do you naturally do when you have to leave a ship?" he asks. "Do you try to selfishly walk off with the ship's massive rudder and all its heavy oars? No, of course not. You simply leave with your own personal gear, your simple clay oil flask, and your little wallet. So, in the exact same way on the journey of life, just firmly remember what actually belongs to you, your own mind and character, and you absolutely will not lay claim to what does not belong to you." Epictetus gives an example of how this detachment works in the face of political tyranny. Imagine the Roman emperor himself says to you, "Remove your broad purple hem," which was a mark of high social status. You should calmly reply, "Very well, I will just wear the narrow hem instead." The emperor says, "Remove that too." "All right," you answer, "I will just wear the plain, ordinary toga now." The tyrant commands, "Take your toga off entirely." "Fine," you agree, "I will happily go completely naked." Frustrated, the tyrant yells, "Now your very composure is provoking me." So you say, "Take my whole body then and kill me." Epictetus asks his students, "Is there absolutely any reason to actually fear someone to whom I stand perfectly ready to just surrender my miserable physical corpse?" No. He moves to another common anxiety, inheritance. But someone complains, "So-and-so will not leave his rich estate to me in his will." Well, Epictetus asks, "I simply forgot that absolutely none of that estate was ever mine in the first place. How then, do we ever logically call it mine? We only call it ours in the exact same way that we might call the rented bed in a temporary inn mine. If the innkeeper dies and happens to leave you his nice bed, fine, take it. But if he leaves it to someone else, then that person will have it, and you will simply have to find a replacement bed. And if you do not find one," he says, "then you will just have to sleep on the bare ground. Only make sure you rest easy there and just snore away peacefully. Because, you must always remember, terrible life tragedies almost exclusively take place among the very rich, among the kings and the powerful potentates. Absolutely no poor man ever swells a Greek tragedy, except perhaps as an anonymous member of the singing chorus in the background. Kings always start their plays off well enough," he observes. "They sing, deck the palace halls. But then, usually around the third or fourth act of the play, we get the tragic wailing. 'O Mount Cithaeron, why did you ever receive me as a baby?'" Epictetus addresses the tragic king directly. "Fool, where exactly are your fancy gold crowns now? Where is your royal diadem? Even your heavily armed guards cannot possibly help you now against fate." So Epictetus gives practical advice. Whenever you have to stand before one of those powerful political tyrants in real life, just bear in mind that you are actually in the presence of a doomed tragic figure. And you are not just looking at the actor playing the part either, but you are looking at the tragic Oedipus himself. But a student objects. The tyrant is so incredibly lucky to be able to walk around town with such a massive entourage of followers. Well, Epictetus jokes, I too mingle with the massive crowds in the marketplace, and so technically I am attended by an enormous entourage as well. The absolute chief thing you must always remember, Epictetus reminds them solemnly, is that the door is always open. Meaning, suicide is always an option if life truly becomes unbearable. Do not be a greater coward than simple children, he says, who are perfectly ready to announce, I will not play this game anymore when they get bored. You should also be ready to say, I will not play anymore when you finally grow completely weary of the game of life, and then just be done with it. But he warns, if you do choose to stay and play the game, do not carp and complain about the rules. The text then shifts to a new chapter, titled more on the same theme. If absolutely everything we have been saying is true, Epictetus begins, and if we are not just being ridiculous, or merely pretending to believe that what is truly good or bad for us lies entirely within our own will, and that we are completely indifferent to absolutely everything else, then why on earth do we still continue to experience such intense fear and anxiety? No one else has any power whatsoever over our own internal principles, and the things that other people actually do control, we simply do not care about. So, he asks his students directly, what exactly is your problem still? A student answers honestly, my problem is that I want very specific instructions on exactly how to act in line with these broad philosophical principles. What other orders do you possibly need than those the supreme god Zeus has already given you? Epictetus asks. God has given you what is your own, your will, making it completely unrestricted and unrestrained. And what is not yours, the external world, he has made restricted and restrained. What specific commandment, then, did you arrive with when? What specific commandment did you arrive in this world with when God sent you here? He asks. The commandment is this. Protect what truly belongs to you at all costs and do not ever desire what logically belongs to another. He lists what belongs to you. Your trustworthiness is your own. Your basic decency is your own, and your moral sense of shame is your own. Absolutely no one else in the world can possibly take them from you, and no one can prevent you from using these qualities, except yourself. And he warns, you do exactly that. You prevent yourself from using them, the very moment you begin to desperately care about what is not yours. In that moment of external desire, you are actively surrendering what is actually yours in the process. With such clear directions and explicit commands coming straight from Zeus, Epictetus challenges the student. What additional, specific orders do you realistically hope to get from me? Am I somehow greater than God, or am I more to be trusted than him? Just keep God's basic commandments, he assures them, and you absolutely will not need any others from me. And as concrete proof that God has actually delivered these commandments to you, you only need to bring your own natural preconceptions to bear. Bring the logical arguments of the philosophers. Bring forward all the moral things that you have often heard, and the things you have often said yourself. Bring what you have read in the books and what you have practically practiced in your life. The truth is already there. But a student might ask, just how long should we actually continue to apply these difficult precepts that we have from God before finally breaking up the game of life? Epictetus answers with a simple standard. Just so long as the game actually remains a pleasure to play. He compares life to a Roman festival. At the wild festival of the Saturnalia, a mock king of the revels is chosen entirely by random chance, simply because this is the fun cultural convention. Then this fake king hands out silly orders to everyone. He says, drink up. You there, mix the wine. You, sir, give us a song. You join the party while you there get lost. And we all happily play along with him, just so that the fun game will not be entirely spoiled on our account. But Epictetus notes, if the fake king suddenly issues an impossible psychological order and says, "Imagine that you are deeply unhappy, and I demur and refuse to do it, who is actually going to force me to be unhappy?" No one can. If, on the other hand, the festival program calls for the dramatic reenactment of Achilles' famous quarrel with Agamemnon, and the actor playing the role of the king says to me, "Go and get the captive Briseis away from Achilles," I will gladly go and play the part. When he says, "Return," I will return. I can play the role without losing my inner peace. He uses another analogy, showing how the way we handle abstract hypothetical arguments in logic class can also serve as a perfect practical model for our daily behavior. Imagine a logic game, he says. Let us logically assume, for the sake of argument, that it is currently night. Fine, you agree. Then is it currently day? The questioner asks. No, you answer, because I have already accepted the working hypothesis that it is night. Let us assume further, the questioner says, in the manner of a game or a play, that you just pretend to believe that it is night. Okay, you say. Now, the questioner commands, genuinely believe in your heart that it really is night. You would logically reply, that forced belief absolutely does not follow from the initial hypothesis. I am just pretending. Epictetus applies this directly to the hardships of life. The exact same logical rules apply in real life, he says. Let us assume you have just come upon very hard times. Granted, you say. Then you are currently unfortunate, the world says. Yes, you agree, by the world's definition. And you are suffering. Yes, you admit. Now, the world commands, genuinely believe in your heart that what has happened to you is actually morally bad. You must reply with the exact same logical clarity, that absolute belief absolutely does not follow from the initial hypothesis. I can suffer without believing I am bad. Besides, he adds, referring to God, there is another higher power who simply will not let me believe it is bad. So he asks again, exactly how long should we submit to the rules of this worldly game? As long as it practically serves my turn, he answers, and for as long as I find playing the part to be basically congenial and acceptable. He contrasts this flexible attitude with the rigidness of others. Some very dour, inflexible types of people will stubbornly say, I simply cannot eat at this man's table if it means. Listening to his boring war stories yet again, I refuse to hear him say, I told you, friend, exactly how I scrambled up the hill in battle. Now we came under renewed bombardment. But Epictetus counters, another, more flexible person in the exact same social situation might simply say, well, the free meal is actually what matters to me right now, so just let him rattle on with his stories to his heart's content. It is entirely for you to personally arrange your own life priorities, he says. But whatever you ultimately decide to do, absolutely do not do it resentfully, acting as if you were being unfairly imposed on by the world. And above all, do not ever actually believe that your situation is genuinely, morally bad. Absolutely no one can actually make you believe that. He uses a famous Stoic metaphor of a smoky room. Is there some smoke in the house? He asks. Well, if it is just a little smoke and it is not actually suffocating, I will simply stay indoors and tolerate it. But if the smoke proves to be far too much for me to bear, I will simply leave the house. You must always remember this ultimate freedom. The door is always open. He applies this open door to political exile. The authorities say to me, "Do not remain in the city of Nicopolis." So I do not remain there. They say, "Do not stay in Athens either." So I quit Athens. They say, "You cannot stay in Rome either." So I abandon Rome. Finally, they command, "You must go live in exile on the barren rock of Gyara." But Epictetus reasons, for me personally, being forced to live on Gyara amounts to far more smoke in my house than I can possibly stand. So I will simply use the open door. I will depart to the one ultimate place that absolutely no one can ever stop me from going to, the place where everyone is eventually made welcome, death. And he says, when I finally remove my very last piece of worldly clothing, which is my own physical skin, then absolutely no one can lay a hold of me any longer. This total lack of fear, Epictetus notes, is exactly why the philosopher Demetrius was emboldened to look the terrifying Emperor Nero right in the eye and say, "You proudly threaten me with death, Nero, but Mother Nature herself already threatens you with the exact same thing." He explains the psychology of control. If I foolishly cherish my physical body, I immediately make a slave of myself. If I cherish my material property, I make a slave of myself. Why? Because I have publicly disclosed to my enemies the exact means by which they can make me their captive. He gives a striking animal example. When a snake defensively pulls back its head to guard it, right away I think to myself, I need to hit it exactly right there, directly on the specific part that it is so desperately protecting. In the exact same way, you may be absolutely sure that whatever you are visibly seen to protect in this life, that exact thing will immediately become your enemy's main focus of attack. If you can just keep this truth firmly in mind, he promises, then there will be absolutely no one in the world that you will ever need to fear, and no one you will ever need to flatter. But a student whines about social status. I really want to sit in the exclusive senator's gallery at the public games. Look, Epictetus tells him bluntly, this suffocating crowd is entirely of your own creation. You are essentially treading on your own toes by desiring to be in that specific, crowded place. But the student protests. How else am I supposed to get a clear view of the stage if I do not sit there? The solution is incredibly simple, Epictetus replies. If you honestly do not want to be crowded by people, then simply do not attend the busy theater in the first place. Really, what is the difficulty here? Or, if you must sit there, just wait patiently until the entire show is completely over and the crowd leaves. Then, you can go in and seat yourself, and you can sun yourself at your complete leisure right there in the empty senator's seats. In general, he concludes, you must always remember that it is we ourselves who actively torment us. It is we who constantly make all these difficulties for ourselves. That is to say, our own internal opinions do the tormenting. He asks a profound question about the nature of offense. What, for instance, does it actually mean to be personally insulted? Stand right by a solid rock, he suggests, and hurl an insult at it. What have you? What have you actually accomplished? He asks. Absolutely nothing. If a person responds to a verbal insult exactly like a solid rock, what has the angry abuser practically gained with all his nasty invective? Nothing. If, however, the abuser actually has his victim's emotional weakness to exploit, then his cruel efforts are worth his while. He gives an example of physical abuse. The authorities order, "Strip him." "What exactly do you mean by strip him?" Epictetus asks. "You mean take his physical garment and remove that. You cannot strip his soul." An abuser says, "I have deeply insulted you." The philosopher simply replies, "A lot of good may it do you, because it does not affect me." That Stoic resilience, Epictetus notes, is exactly what the great Socrates practiced his entire life, maintaining absolutely always the exact same even, peaceful temper. But looking at his current students, he laments, "It seems that we would rather practice and study absolutely anything else in the world, rather than actually studying how to remain internally free and unenslaved." A student complains, but philosophers speak in such strange, confusing paradoxes. And what of the other arts and sciences? Epictetus shoots back. Are they really any different? What is possibly more paradoxical, on the surface, than physically cutting into a living person's delicate eye just to restore their blurry vision? If someone suggested this surgical procedure to a person who was completely ignorant of modern medicine, they would just laugh directly in the medical practitioner's face. Little wonder, then, he concludes, if many of the deep truths of philosophy also initially impress the uneducated masses as being completely paradoxical. The text then shifts to a new chapter, titled "What is the Law of Life?" When a person in the school was reading aloud the standard hypothetical arguments from a textbook, Epictetus interrupted and said, "This is a strict law concerning logical hypotheses, that we must rationally accept whatever logically follows by way of a conclusion." But he warns, even more incredibly cogent and important than that is the fundamental law of life itself, which obliges us to act completely in accordance with human nature. If we truly mean to obey this law of life in every single area, and on every single occasion, then clearly we must never allow what nature logically prescribes to somehow escape us, and we must never allow into our lives what runs fundamentally contrary to nature. So he explains the curriculum. This is exactly why philosophers always start us out with abstract logic. They do this simply since it is much easier, purposely reserving the far more problematic, practical subjects of daily life for later. In the quiet study of abstract logic, there is absolutely nothing around to emotionally distract us. Whereas, in real practical matters in the outside world, our attention is constantly being pulled in 1,000 other directions by our desires and fears. Whoever insists on jumping right into practical matters first, without training, risks making a complete fool of himself, since it is absolutely not easy tackling the much harder subjects first. And this logic, he advises his young students, is the exact right, respectful defense for you to use with your own parents when they get upset with their children, just because they choose to study philosophy instead of business or law. You should say to them, "Have it your own way, Father. My judgment is very poor right now, and I fully admit that I do not know what I really should be doing with my life. But Father, if this skill of living well can neither be learned nor taught by anyone, then please do not blame me for lacking it. If it can be taught, however, then either teach it to me yourself, or just let me learn it from someone else who actually professes to know how to do it." The student should continue reasoning with his father, "Since I certainly hope you do not suppose that, if I am currently doing the wrong thing, it is by my own deliberate choice. I want to be good. So what else could possibly explain my current error but simple ignorance? And would not you much rather that I be cured of that ignorance?" When did a father's shouting anger, however, ever successfully teach someone how to play a musical instrument, or how to pilot a complex ship? Do you honestly imagine that your yelling anger is going to help teach me the far more complex business of navigating human life? But Epictetus warns his students, using that noble line of argument with your parents strongly assumes that such a desire to be good actually is your true, sincere motive for studying philosophy here. Unfortunately, anyone who is just learning logic and just attending my philosophy lectures simply to make a shallow show of erudition at a